Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Panke-Buisse. I'm a research microbiologist at the US Dairy Forage Research Center. I'm really excited to be speaking to you today. I'm definitely missing the in-person ambiance of World Dairy Expo and all the sounds and the great company and new people to meet. But hopefully this is still a helpful talk, and maybe we'll generate some digital conversation surrounding it. So today we'll talk a little about why we might inoculate silage and a couple of questions that get a little deeper than that. Just first of all, who I am. Other than my name, I've put up some quotes here that are guiding principles for me that I've carried. And when I was in school, I dreamed of working for the Agricultural Research Service. This was a long time coming for me, and I'm really quite pleased to be here with all of you today and doing the research that we're doing. And I came by my interests and my passions for agriculture pretty honestly. Grew up in Wisconsin, surrounded by and in a farm family. So just we'll take a moment here, right? And the history of silage inoculation itself is kind of interesting, but it's not, it's not super riveting. So if you're interested in that, we can speak about it. I'll put my contact info up at the end. But the history of inoculation and what that is, I think, is pretty relevant to our discussion. So traditionally, inoculation was the intentional infection of a host with a pathogen or a disease, with the hopes of creating resistance. Right? It's the earliest form of immunization that we know of. But now it refers mostly to the transfer of a microorganism into a new environment, which is what we're doing, right? When we buy inoculant and we seed that into our forage, right? But I would like to think about the pile in slightly a different way. If you think about the pile itself as a living organism, right? The term inoculation fits really well because we do it in order to try and safeguard against bad actors, right? So there's this idea of domesticated microbes, right? These are things that we work with, and they do good things for us, right? And everyone's got a few pet favorites, especially in Wisconsin. Brewer's yeast is pretty popular, right? Humans have been working with microbes for as long as we've been working with really dogs, horses, pigs, cows. We've been together a long time, but they're really only sort of domesticated, right? And that includes bakers and brewers yeasts and lactic acid bacteria, right? You can think of them more like cats than dogs that way. And this is a little bit of a stereotype, but my cats and dogs agree, so I feel comfortable sharing it, is that dogs will do things to make you happy, right? Cats do things so that you'll make them happy. So these microorganisms, right, their benefits to us are a lot more like a contract or an economic exchange. We feed them, and they produce, by their own motivation, these organic acids that allow us to keep forages edible much long past their fresh eating window expires. And really a note on microbiology in general, rather than just silage itself, is that microbes are everywhere. They coat every surface. They've been found everywhere on Earth. They can survive in space. There's a lot of fun anecdotes that a teaspoon of soil contains 1 million different species of bacteria. It's fascinating, right? Depending on how you count, even human beings are only 50 to 10% human. Our microbes are part of us, and they help us do the things that we need to do. And that's no different than other agroecosystem processes. And ensiling is this process of us feeding the microorganisms we want, right? And we have to sculpt that pile in such a way and manage it so that we get the results that we want. We select for the microorganisms that are the most desired. And the easiest way to do that is to just pour them in many cases, although we still have to follow good practice. So the major organisms of interest here are going to be the lactic acid bacteria group. And these aren't defined only by their name, right? Lactobacillus aren't the only lactic acid bacteria. They're defined by their primary product, right? They make lactic acid. And these guys are everywhere, right? They're responsible for sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, sour beer. They're everywhere in the food system, right? Probiotics, yogurt. So they're pretty ubiquitous and important. But for our purposes, we're really looking at them for their role in forage conservation and preservation, right? So these bacteria are defined by what they consume, what environment that they live in, and then what they produce, right? So we know that they produce lactic acid for the most part. And they do that by eating the sugar, the water-soluble carbohydrates that are present in our chopped forage. And they do a really, really good job of it. But they're the best at it in the absence of oxygen, which is why we have to get that silo sealed and we have to get it packed tight. On the other side of the coin, however, there are spoilage organisms that we need to look out for. And a quick review of those can include yeasts, molds, Clostridia on the very negative end, and acetic acid bacteria, which can really affect your aerobic stability, right? These organisms can lead to loss or spoilage, right? And we have been pretty fortunate in the modern era that a lot of the really terrible things that plagued producers in the past are much less frequent now. But silage can also harbor animal pathogens and interfere with the food system in unforeseen ways, right? So in the top picture, what you can see is an example of Clostridial contamination of the milk that was used to make these aged cheeses, right? And so this kind of blowing out of the cheese is a major fault, and it's a total loss. And you don't find out until later, which is really problematic, especially for an aged value-added product. But even more seriously, on the bottom, you can see the classic signs of botulism in cattle. The flaccid, limp tongue, the animals can't rise and do eventually die when they're fed silage that was contaminated with botulism, right? So these are things that we really need to watch out for. And they're the reason that we started inoculating silages in the first place. So silage inoculation is, of course, directly adding the wanted silage organisms to the forage, right? The idea here being that we can shut out the bad actors. We can fill their place in the silage just through sheer numbers, thus inhibiting loss and spoilage. Right, so some inoculants that you can find are formulated for specific scenarios that might be helpful to you, right? Forage species obviously is a big one, but if you live in a very warm place, right, high temp, stable silage inoculants might be very helpful. And then probably the gold shining star for silage inoculants is also going to be aerobic stability. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a second, but some of the claims you might have heard are going to be things like better preservation of your forage, right? Improved forage quality, and potentially animal performance boosts as a result of inoculating your silage. And so we'll break that down a little bit and we'll continue to talk about it. I used to talk to my grandpa a lot about these kinds of things, and his response whenever we talked about inoculation and you know, how do you know what to pick? How do you know what to do? He was a traditionalist, and he said, it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. And I don't know that that's true, but he was really fond of saying it. The why in the question of why inoculate is as unique as your farm, your use, the forage you're putting up, the weather, and the budget. Right, and you might ask, if these good microbes are everywhere, why would I need to add more of them, right? And we'll get into that. But really, you know, there's at least as many whys as there are people putting up forage to begin with, right? So a couple of caveats. I'm not here to tell you that you have to inoculate your silage all the time, right? It's a professional passion of mine to grow microbes, right? But that's not, you have to do what's best for your situation, right? You have to follow your why. So not inoculating is a viable and a valid choice, right? Inoculating won't hurt and can have really solid benefits. And it's not all or nothing. Inoculating some crops, but not others, to balance your costs can be a really smart play. So the biggest thing is just having asking the right questions to be able to make those decisions from a highest value standpoint, right? So some better questions that we might be able to ask are whether or not, right, to inoculate, and then with what. So if we're asking questions, right, of whether or not, it becomes really important what you're putting up, right? So if you're putting up corn, sorghum, or sugarcane, right, your answer might be very different than someone putting up alfalfa grass or small grain. You know, you got to look ahead to that forecast, as variable as they might be. And if you're expecting perfect weather, then perfect is perfect, right? But I see a lot more iffy and oh no. You can ask yourself if it was a bad year for mold, right? Depending on what crop you're putting up. You can ask yourself honestly how your face management and bunk time is, you know, depending on how fast you feed out. Maybe your food doesn't stay in the bunk that long. Aerobic stability is not that important to you. Then again, maybe it is. And then another really important question to ask is, you know, what's the most important if your resources are limited? How do you parse that out? So if we're talking about with what we're inoculating, this picture is just kind of a joke because I'm not going to put up a specific inoculant label here. So this is actually an edited label from a probiotic, but you know, the same general idea applies, and that is that there is a ridiculous variety of these available inoculants, and they're proprietary, and some of them come with all the fancy bells and whistles, right? How do you know what to choose, right? And so knowing what you need becomes really important there. And the labels do contain the information that you need, right? And you can shop around, and the best solution is going to be the one that works for your why, right? Some products are going to work differently than others, and there is very likely a handful that will be very helpful to you if you have a need that can be filled by silage inoculation, right? So one of the first things to look for is what kinds of LAB or lactic acid bacteria are in the products that you're looking at, right, that are available to you. So the first one we have here are the heterofermenters, right? And this probably won't appear on your label, but they're products that they make are mixed, right? So lactic acid is still usually their primary product, but you'll get other things along with it, like ethanol or CO2, right? So the issues with ethanol and CO2 as production products is that they're a little bit lower efficiency. CO2 is generally lost as a gas, so that's dry matter that's just out the window, right? But ethanol is really volatile, right? So if you have a long exposure at the face, you're going to lose the ethanol too. Acetic acid is interesting, right? Because it increases aerobic stability, but often it comes with those other twos. A notable, the other two being ethanol and CO2, right? But a notable exception to that is Lactobacillus buchneri. So Lactobacillus buchneri does a very interesting and novel chemistry, and it can make acetic acid and another byproduct called 1,2-propanediol from the lactic acid that's already in the silo. So this is a very efficient route to make acetic acid and to increase aerobic stability, which is why it has become as popular as it has, right? And on the other side, we have the homofermenters, right? I like to call these one-trick ponies, but it's a really good trick. So they can very efficiently take a single sugar molecule, right, from in your forage, and they pretty much crack it in half into 2 lactic acid molecules. It drops that pH faster than any other. It's efficient because you're not wasting anything as gas. There's no loss. Unfortunately, lactic acid doesn't produce great aerobic stability, right? So when you look at a formulation of an inoculant, people aren't strangers to this trade-off in efficiency, right? So you don't find all that many single strain inoculants anymore, right? That's going to have one inoculant that you're just going to bet it all on, right? If you do find those, they occasionally are just a Lactobacillus buchneri, right? And then you're generally relying on the homofermenters out in the environment to do your lactic acid production for you, right? You can find homofermenter mixes, right? And so these are going to be rapid and efficient, like we talked about. Aerobic stability might be lower, but man, they're fast, right? The other thing is that they might be mixed so that you can take advantage of better opportunities, right? So you'll see something like a plantarum and a pediococcus mix to kind of cover your bases in terms of heat, crop, things like that, right? There's also the heterofermenter mixes, right? This would be your Lactobacillus buchneri, maybe Hilgardii. Those are the ones that are going to generally be giving you better aerobic stability. There are some special ones on the market that come with additional chemistries that the microbes can do. They come with enzymes, things like that. You'll have to explore those. There's also mixed inoculants, right? And this is kind of the brainchild of, well, why can't we have the best of both worlds, right? So generally they're a mix of these fast, efficient homofermenters and usually a versatile heterofermenter like Lactobacillus buchneri in order to improve aerobic stability on the back end. So taken all together, right, there's a couple general guidelines that we can draw out, right? And this is all based on the data, and I've got some references in here, and I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards as well. But if you're putting up alfalfa, grass, or small grain, right, inoculation shows consistent improvements in forage quality, stability, and proteolysis in research studies, right, by and large. The biggest thing to remember here is that inoculation won't protect from mismanagement, right? It'll protect from non-ideal circumstances, right? But you still got to put it up right, keep it covered. Don't overfill your pile for both safety and preservation reasons, right? And always remember that poor pile maintenance and bad silage charges interest, and it usually charges it through your milk check or vet bills, right? So moving on from that though, corn, sorghum, and sugarcane, I mentioned, are a little bit different, right? This is where we see a lot of people saying, you know, do I really need to inoculate corn, sorghum, and sugarcane? And I'm not going to tell you to do it. I'm not going to tell you not to do it. What I will say is that outside of ideal conditions, your stakes are higher and your relative benefits improve for all crops, even corn, right? What we know is that corn has an abundance of natural lactic acid bacteria, and it will ferment just fine on its own in many cases. Especially ideal scenarios, right? It's got that low buffering capacity, that pH comes down beautifully. It's gorgeous, right? One thing I can say with certainty though is that if aerobic stability is a concern for you, Lactobacillus buchneri is going to be your friend, right? So if we look at a meta-analysis of Lactobacillus buchneri addition in corn silage, the averages on this showed a 25 hours to heating for uninoculated corn, right? And if you inoculated under 100,000 CFU per gram fresh weight forage, it was 35 hours, right? But 100,000 CFU or better got you 503 hours, which is pretty impressive. So that's something to think about for sure when you're weighing those options, right? One other thing that you'll see reported, I think, pretty often is animal performance benefits of inoculation, right? And so this is still a pretty active area of research. Right? We don't have a great mechanism for why you might experience an increase in animal production, but we have seen it in a few research studies, right? Including reviews of several studies. The averages show that it can be favorable, right? The mechanism behind that it could be related to increased digestibility. It could be increased dry matter intake. It could be a more favorable split in protein fractions, right? Better preservation of water-soluble carbohydrates might play a role. This is a thing that we're still actively working on, and groups in many different countries are, right? And there's a bit of a play on the word performance. You can see a cow here wearing a virtual reality headset. That's a real picture. A group in Russia, and I think a few other places now, have looked at using virtual reality to decrease stress in cows, right? And the point of putting that in here is that people will do some pretty amazing things to boost performance and really bring out their cow's potential, right? And inoculants may be a way that you can do that as well. But getting back to brass tacks, right? We're talking about whether or not. Okay, so the biggest things to think about here are going to be, your crop that you're putting up, right? What you want out of that inoculation, right? And if that's well represented, aerobic stability, for example, if you want that, Lactobacillus buchneri often delivers, right? Legumes, grasses, and small grains generally benefit from inoculation across the board, right? Even for corn and sorghum, as I mentioned, aerobic stability can be a problem. L-buchneri can often help, right? It's a staple. And then animal performance benefits aren't guaranteed, but it should be in your mind as you weigh the cost benefits of your silage inoculation. If that's something that tips it in your favor, and that helps that economic calculus work out, then it's probably a good bet, right? So I just wanted to say thank you for your time and attention. Stay safe out there, everybody. And I've put up my contact info so that if you'd like to send me an email or talk more, I'd love to do that. Let me know. Thanks a lot.